Thank you all for being here. I have the pleasure of speaking with Joel. I should note, I met Joel about a little bit over a year ago. Joel and his team at NCRI, the Network Contagion Research Institute. We met in Princeton, and Joel was showing me a lot of the tools that they had created, a lot of the data that they had gathered that spoke to the issue of extremism online, these sort of incubators of hate. And literally within 5 minutes, Joel and I sort of agreed on two things. One is we need to work together, which we've done. But the second was that things are going to get worse.
Right.
And frankly, since that meeting, and really in the last 7 months or so, we've seen just how prescient, in a sense, that conversation was. Whether it's in Pittsburgh, in New Zealand, in Poway, where we've seen not just these sort of digital hate groups organizing, but that these extremists are signaling back to these communities, where they're weaponizing and preparing their social media strategies as they're preparing their next attack. So, these are not light topics, but this is where anybody who's interested, not just understanding extremism and hate, but mitigating it, this is the space we need to be in. So with that sort of basic intro, we don't dabble in light topics here. The question for you, Joel, to start off is, how do you and your team approach this very serious issue?
Yeah, so, going back to what you were saying about our conversation, it was hauntingly prophetic. And I want to give you all a sense of how that conversation ended. We turned to one another and we said, look, we're seeing this data on the rise of extremism in these communities. And we can see that it's doubled, that the white supremacy, the anti-Semitism, and this is going to get really bad because we can see that it's related to events like Charlottesville and these kinds of violent attacks. Oren, I remember telling you, I think this is going to get to the point where it feels like it's coming from everywhere. And it's everybody, and it's nowhere, and it's nobody. And the whole thing is going to be made to look like it's a joke. So when these attacks started happening, we had almost predicted this a year ago, that it would get to this point. So the question for the audience, I think, is how did we know that? Because in order to understand how we did know that, you would have to see it with our tools. These events aren't coming from nowhere. They're coming from social media. There's an unseen layer of influence that is percolating into the real world through living communities online of people who would never have the chance to meet each other 50 years ago, but can now find each other readily. And they gather in these places, in several different small and large communities. And what's happening in those communities? What are they saying? How are they organizing? We actually don't know unless we go in and we take the data from those communities and we use machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to extract the trends to see what's happening within those communities and capture their language. Then we need to see how their propaganda is spreading out to the rest of the web. And what we see there is that these are red zones of infection. That's the right way to think about what's happening in some of these darker communities that we're studying. That they are propagandizing all kinds of hate, and that's actually starting to work.
So talk a little bit more about some of the details there. How is this not just spreading, but how do you even identify, potential threats in these communities? What's your fundamental approach to understanding the language?
Right, so we use tools that literally, it's like an AI goes into the community and almost becomes a community member. It learns how every word is related to every other word. What is the kind of lingo that they use? And it's able to decode that. That's really important, guys, because you can imagine it's almost like a sickness or a pathogen. They have these different ways of talking amongst themselves, and they're trying to avoid being detected by the body. That's what's happening in these communities. And our tools are able to learn the language that they're using amongst themselves, this coded words, strange images and memes, right? Those are the things that end up getting trafficked to the rest of the internet.
So tell us a little bit about some of the study that we've done jointly, but that you've done as well with the sentiment and the narratives that are being used. Right? You've studied sentiment like white genocide, the Great Awakening, acceleration. These are all key, not just ideological ideas, in particular for white supremacists, but these are the motivating thoughts. These are the motivating ideas that are influencing people to action. What have you found specifically also regarding anti-Semitism as a foundation for those narratives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that these organizations, they've been built on organizing political resentment. And if they weren't set out to be anti-Semitic, anti-Semitism is so core to the action of organizing political resentment that they would have become that way anyway. It's so central to the organizing principles, and we see that beyond any other ethnic group on these communities, Jews are uniquely being singled out. And so I think that we can see with some of our tools that we have these memes that they're generating, right? And how do these communities form? Where do they get this weird language? I think the way to think about it is that these tend to be antisocial people, and they tend to say inappropriate things on other networks. And then they tend to get kicked out of those networks. And so these people can be deplatformed for their places. So some of the work that we've done, and I think this work is pioneering and incisive, is looking at how these kinds of communities organize. So what you can see in the slide that I'm about to show you is that whenever large events of censorship occur, and you can go ahead and play the slide now, on Twitter, you have huge increases in membership on some of these alt-right communities, in this case Gab, where the Pittsburgh shooter came from. And so the political events like Unite the Right matter, that increases their membership. But we can see that the biggest growth in membership occurs when major bans occur for the Proud Boys, for Alex Jones, and of course events like Pittsburgh. So this deplatforming, the censorship, it's driving antisocial people to come together. And as a psychologist who has studied antisocial behavior, I will tell you that the worst thing you can do with people who have antisocial behavior problems is put them together in small places where they can educate one another in terms of how they can more effectively be antisocial. And then they become genius in finding new ways to do that. Guys, what's happening here is that we have a conversation that's become hostile on the left, right? It's become hostile in terms of political correctness. And they're saying, we're really good at spotting these Nazis. We can tell who they are. We're the key, we're the best at creating a community of the good and kicking all the people who are not good outside of this community. And then you have a community of people, right? And this community of people are experts in showing and making jokes about not being a Nazi, okay? The jokes say, I'm not a Nazi, these horrible, beamy, jokey language, and now you have a group that says, I'm an expert in telling who isn't a Nazi. What's left isn't a conversation. What's left is a hostage crisis, right? Increasingly, those two groups are taking aim at one another, and predictably, that will make both groups more powerful. The only thing more predictable than that is that Jewish life is going to be caught right in the middle of it.
So let me ask you, I mean, understanding how these networks sort of feed on one another, but also that we have to deal with the broader ecosystem. It's not one platform. They spread amongst many platforms, in fact, use other platforms in order to make their message. It's one thing to track that information the way we do to try to identify leads and people to investigate before, hopefully, an act of violence is committed. But does that also play in to the broader mainstreaming of anti-Semitism and bigotry?
Right.
Does what happened on 8chan and 4chan actually influence the public discussion?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that the scope of that question is probably bigger than you meant to ask.
I hear that actually quite a bit.
So let me say this, guys. These guys believe that they were effective in getting somebody into the White House. They believe their language was used by that person. There are dictators or would-be dictators in Hungary who are using these memes to seize power. There are people in Brazil who are using them to take over whole countries. And so a new principled form of organization is taking place between mobs online and the seizing of political power. They are not content to remain in the margins of online society. They are taking over governments in their own imagination. The scope of this couldn't be bigger. The people who are seizing power are using these ideas of white genocide, of Soros, of various other myths. Where did they come from? They came from these inventive antisocial goons who in this cesspool are driving up propaganda. That's called platform-sponsored propaganda. The crowd is doing it by itself. It no longer needs a Nazi party. It no longer needs any of that. It has all the tools of production that it needs, and it can generate the best content. See, the thing is, guys, the research that we've done, I think the most important thing to take away from this, for lawmakers, for everybody, is that the research that the Network Contagion Research Institute and the ADL have partnered, this is the most incisive and cutting-edge research of its kind that I know of. The way to understand what we have found is that we have unveiled a new mode of organized criminal activity. At the center of that activity is the web platform. And what the web platform is permitting people to do is to sustain ongoing campaigns of terror in such a way that people never need to see one another's face. They never need to know one another's name. And how does it work? Well, we can see after the attacks that occurred in Poway, which came from 8chan, one of the communities that we monitor, and the attacks that occurred in New Zealand, that the membership and the attendance in these platforms sprang through the roof. The biggest term, the term most used on 8chan almost every day for months is Jew. No other word comes close to that. Okay, this is a 24/7 KKK rally, and when the murders happen, they speak the language of these memes. These aren't lone wolves. These are cells in a body. And see, the thing to understand about that is that when the murders happen, that's where everyone's going to go to catch in on the inside story. Guys, that's good for business. Murder is part of the business cycle of these organizations. The fact that the murder happens is because they are speculating on a market niche to capture an audience and feed a need that they believe they can capitalize on.
So let me stop you there. So, you know, we'll debate this later in our breakout if you want to join us. But I mean, does this truly, implicate the platforms themselves? I mean, these are antisocial people looking for antisocial media and to join a community. I mean, they will find that and create that on their own, will they not?
So let me give you an example, guys, of what we're looking at. What do Poway, what does New Zealand and Pittsburgh have in common? Well, all three attackers had the same exact motive: white genocide. All three attackers called for their communities. They turned back to their communities and messaged to them right before the attacks. In the messages that they left, they encouraged their communities to turn them into memes.
And more so, they encouraged the community to participate in their act of terror with them, right? They provided links that people, in theory, would be able to watch them carry out their attacks.
Can we move to slide 3 for a second? Where are they getting this, guys? White genocide. Well, go ahead and hit play again. White genocide is a war on white. It's white victimizations. We need a white nation to help us fight it back, because we know that Hitler was right. It's the Jews who are doing this. What are the Jews doing? Name the Jew. It's them. They are bringing in the migrants. The migrants they're bringing in, we have to defend Europe, ban Islam, and build the wall. Okay? This is what our AI learned, not from studying the murderers, from studying their communities. The language of their criminal intent is being puppeteered through them. They're downloading the language of their stated motives for murder from a mythological superstructure. In fact, understanding why they did this is incoherent unless you understand what the mythology of the community is.
So I find myself often being sort of a Joel to English dictionary. So now that has come up, and it's a total pleasure, by the way. Can you just explain a little bit more about this process of identifying these words and their connections online?
Sure.
And what that narrative is telling us, what you can make of those connections,
okay,
and how that will ultimately help us mitigate this spread online.
Right. Well, I think it seems to me that we use our tools to basically, this is the mechanics of how it works. I'll go through this quickly. Our tools create a star chart of meaning. Once they go into these communities, they can look at how the images, the words, the videos are connected to each other. And they create a star chart, except instead of space, space is now meaning. And so if there's a word, there tends to be a bunch of different kinds of conversation about that word. The word is like a galaxy. The conversations that I showed you are like solar systems. And so we can see what the conversation is like for this entire community. And these communities, they're calling for a white caliphate, for crying out loud. The people who are on them are asking the communities to turn them into memes so that they can, I don't know, be immortal like a martyr. What does this sound like, guys? This sounds like ISIS. Okay? These communities build themselves as free speech platforms. Nothing that we have suggests that that's true. All of the information that we have suggests that these are terrorist. This is the aiding and abetting of terrorism, pure and simple. And that is the business plan. And so now your question is, what can we do about this? Well, first of all, we better see it. If there's one thing we know, we'd better have eyes that see and ears that hear. Because if we don't see this, there's no way we're going to be able to handle it. There's two directions we need to come at, and these tools can be very helpful in both of them. The first is litigation. These platforms, as they exist now, are protected in ways that we might deem absurd, because everything that I've shown you apparently is legal. That's a problem. So it seems to me that people who have been harmed, where I think we can show pretty clearly, these platforms might have something to do with that. And the families should bring litigation. Anyone who gets between those families and that platform, sei gesund, fellas. Really, really. Because this is an issue of justice. And then the second question is seeing this, what can legislators do? Because our laws are being brought into question everywhere by this exactly. This is what is affording an attack against international law. That isn't a coincidence. It's a feature of what they're trying to do. They're creating a genocidal plot that focuses on Jewish life in order to create strongman governance and anarchy everywhere.
So the good news is we're there. We have partners with NCRI, through our Center on Technology and Society, with a range of others, and we're watching, and we're trying to understand it so that we can then mitigate these threats. And with 5 seconds left, I just have to say, for anybody who else wants to get deeper into this conversation, see what we're doing, and have a follow-up discussion, our breakout is at 5:15, 5:30. Thank you all so much. We appreciate it.